first of the seminars by Professor Nida, where I believe you are expected to
Sit here?
sit here.
I don't feel like sitting. I stand normally, but you don't mind.
You can stand if you want.
I'm sure it'll pick it up.
We are very glad to welcome him to our new faculty, and we hope the seminar will be great intellectual enlightenment for us all. And I think we are especially glad since you have already become like almost a mythological, almost a biblical figure. And I just want to remind everyone that the seminar will be held also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow at the same time, from 5:30 to 7:30. And on Friday morning, there will be a panel discussion at 12:30, which will be also attended by two Catalan scholars of biblical translation from Montserrat, which probably won't be two, but apparently will be three, and she's got a phone call. And so we hope that we'll get lots of new insights on the relevance of sociolinguistics for interpreting and translating, and also about biblical translation, which probably was the first, or one of the first translations ever to exist, and it's a subject that really touched very, very lives. Probably know more about it.
Thank you.
I think Professor Nida will speak probably for about an hour and a half, then we have a little break, and then about half an hour discussion. What more discussion? Say so.
We can stay as long as you like. Okay. Well, I'm very, very delighted to have a chance to be here. I've already learned a great deal, and I realize that in large measure, I'm speaking to the converted. Because, first of all, of course, Jack and Nida met me, and we spent 2 or 3 hours discussing what was happening in this school, your emphasis upon culture and pragmatics and these types of things. Sociolinguistics, that's another name for a lot of things you obviously have been doing. Then I spent some time reading a fascinating article by Sean Golden, prepared for an encyclopedia in China. Excellent outline of the approach to this type of training program. And then, of course, Francesca has certainly filled me in on a lot of new ideas that you folks are developing. So, I'm delighted to be in a place where apparently sociolinguistics is not a naughty word, because in some parts of the academic world, that is true. So, let's have a chance to discuss together some of these fascinating aspects, not just of the structure of language, but the use of language. And frankly, that's what it's all about. Because, mind you, all we know from competence comes from performance, or it isn't language. Now, you would be amazed how many times serious errors take place because people do not really grasp the concept that language is a part of culture and that words only have meanings within the cultures in which they exist. For example, fine missionary was working in an African language in East Africa, and he asked the people, "What is your word for a virgin?" And he got a word, he put it into the New Testament, and later on, there was a cult that simply blossomed and grew very fast. And all these young women wanted to join it. And part of the initiation into this cult was engaging in ritual sexual intercourse. Well, of course, the missionary immediately began to preach against this. But the people said, but if the mother of Jesus was a member of this cult, what's wrong with it? Well, he had used a word which did identify virgins, but virgins who participated in a cult practice which made them non-virgins, obviously. Well, you would be surprised how many times we publish scriptures that we have to buy back from the people. Now, of course, you're all acquainted with false friends. These little sociolinguistic problems that occur when one language contaminates another, at least in usage. So, time after time in Latin America, I've been approached by people who want to assist me in my classes. Of course, they want to attend. But when they tell me they want to assist me, or assist my class, at least for a moment, I misinterpret what they're trying to say. But look at something even more complex and more subtle. For example, right now, I'm translating all of the notes of a Bible prepared by an interconfessional committee in Spanish. This is notes for a Bible. And I'm translating and adapting them into English. But I have a real problem. Because if I translate rather closely, using what you expect people to use, namely cognates, I have raised the level in English 2 or 3 times higher than the Spanish. Because our Latin derivative vocabulary is high-level vocabulary. And I simply have to consciously avoid that type of thing. For example, embriagado in Spanish is a fairly common word in Latin America for being drunk. But am I going to say in English, inebriated? That's a very high word, which a high percentage of English-speaking people simply don't know. Now I could translate it intoxicated. That's a little bit lower than inebriated, but most people will say drunk. Now, of course, I could, if I wanted to go somewhat lower, talk about a person being stoned or being soused, which is even lower than stoned. And so, when we begin to translate, we have a sociolinguistic problem of levels of language. Or take the problem of participles. My problem now is very complicated. By a professor who prepared a number of the notes. He's a real Latin scholar. In fact, he lectures in Latin in the Vatican, the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and he writes the best Ciceronian Spanish I have ever come across. Now, if you know anything about Cicero, you know how well he uses participles. And this material is filled with participles. I can't use participles in English. Now, grammatically it's possible, but the level of language is immediately raised so that people have to take a double take every time they come across a participle. So, now sometimes, of course, it's even worse, because people don't realize the register, if you like to call it, or, as other people might want to say, the particular form of language and the function the language performs. For example, if anyone knows Steinbeck's story about the of mice and men, fascinating, beautiful, beautiful story. Anyway, 2 men are on a bus, and they immediately yell to the truck driver to tell him to stop the bus. But he's rascal, and he drives on about a half a mile. These fellas get off. They know they have to walk back. And so in English they say, Jesus Christ, he's a stupid bastard. Now, in Chinese, that kind of a statement, literally, Jesus Christ is not regarded as a emphatic, because Jesus Christ, he's a stupid bastard, means this man is certainly a stupid bastard. Jesus Christ is only an emphatic element. But in Chinese, when you have topic comment types of sentences, the closest equivalent turned out to be, in Chinese, Jesus Christ is an ignorant hybrid. Because they assumed that Jesus Christ is now the subject. Jesus Christ, he, of course. That must be a reference to Jesus Christ. Or one sentence that I've given to many people, and I tried it on several different classes in China. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And everybody missed it. Why? Because, of course, they didn't know the history of the terminology. They all said, of the government of the people. Of course, it's the government that belongs to the people. But in the history of American English, it isn't the government that belongs to the people, it's the government that receives its powers from the people. The older usage of meaning from. Now, frankly, I didn't expect them to get it right. But I simply used the illustration to point out how there may be a historical background to a particular expression, which, if you don't have a lot of background in that history of the language and its usage, you're going to miss. Because you're not going to find that particular meaning in the dictionary, unless it's a very voluminous dictionary which deals with historical developments. But people are always asking me this question. I don't know how many times I've been asked, what is the most difficult thing to translate? Have you ever had that discussed? Well, I posed it to a group of translators and interpreters at the United Nations. Fascinating group of folks representing so many different languages. Ah, they said. And I thought immediately, lyric poetry, something, legal documents. No, they said. It's when the people don't say anything. Now, I'll tell you, I've had the same experience, quite frankly, in interpreting. When a person doesn't say anything, you think you must be wrong, that you haven't heard it right. And you try to make sense out of what is nonsense. And it's very hard to do. And unfortunately, politicians seem to have gone to school in how to talk, and still not say anything. And they are often very expert, and sometimes rather purposefully. We certainly have plenty of those politicians in the United States. Now, just in order to emphasize something you probably already know, but just to have a framework for what I want to say in the next couple of days, I want to distinguish carefully between linguistics in its more traditional sense, the present time, and sociolinguistics. Because for me, there is a vast difference. Now, linguistics is either the study of items of language and their arrangements, with all of the elements of government and binding and dependencies and relations and that, or it is the study of language as a system for communicating designative and associative meanings, more or less the type of thing that Holliday speaks about. The first description I gave was more or less typical of generative transformational grammar. Now, I would like to propose a different approach to language, which of course a number of folks have done, Himes and Gumpert and a number of other people. But sociolinguistics is the study of the uses of language and the values attached to language, both its use and its form. Now this is a very different orientation. By the way, in the United States now, quite frankly, I think the sociolinguists are producing a great deal more that is creative and changing people's attitude with regard to language than even the linguists. Now, sociolinguistics emphasizes the relationship of language to culture and culture to language. And mind you, language is a part of culture, because language is simply the totality of beliefs and practices of a people. And language is something we practice, don't we? We do it. It's one of these built-in habits for communication. Now maybe I can make it a little clearer if I point out an analogy, and it's always dangerous, but nevertheless it may be helpful to you, of thinking of language, the linguistic study of language, and I've been doing a lot of it myself, don't worry. Can't help people in a couple hundred languages around the world without trying to get a little bit of linguistics. But we can say that linguistics concentrates on the anatomy of language, just like anatomy would concentrate on the parts of the body and their relationships one to another. And anatomy deals with development aspect of anatomy and comparative anatomy between different organisms that may be related in different ways. Now, what about sociolinguistics? Sociolinguistics is more the physiology of language. How does this organism work? What happens? What are its uses? How does it function? And that seems to me, though it's, of course, not absolute, but in no sense of the word, but still that it can be helpful. And I mention this because I feel that in some regards American linguistics, especially in the generative transformational area, has gone off the deep end by saying that syntax is autonomous. Nothing is autonomous in language. Nothing is autonomous in culture. It cannot be separated one from the other. We are all interlinked, of course, and I hope to be able to explain the reasons for that as we proceed. But first, this means, I think, that I need to just mention briefly, which probably most of you already know, but I'm going to be referring back to this type of thing a bit more, the various functions of language. And I want to mention first the psychological. One of the important elements of language is this capacity to name things. Have a way of using sounds to refer to something. I think you've all read the story of Helen Keller, haven't you? That tremendous transformation that took place in this child's life when she found a way of symbolizing water. This was just simply an emotional and intellectual revolution for her. I saw a woman in the Chol area, this is a Chol Indian, who was born completely deaf, could not hear a thing. And yet this woman, as she grew up, learned how to use gesture to communicate what she wanted and to begin to talk with people. And she, as an adult woman, had taught all the other women in that community her form of symbol language, sign language. She had never had contact with Spanish-speaking people who used sign language. She made this all up herself, and she could even talk with the missionary whom she taught her language, everything about the Bible. Incredible. But this is a very significant aspect. People simply have to have some way of symbolizing something else. Signs to stand for something other than themselves. But it's not a matter just of naming. It's a matter of declaring, as it were, saying something. It may be questions, it may be anything else. Imperatives. But we feel like we not only can name topics, we have to make comments about those topics. This is a psychological necessity that we experience. But we also use language to model experience. Modeling experience by means of language. For example, we build up taxonomies, don't we? We have object and then we have animal, and we make a distinction between mammals and non-mammals, and then we make a distinction between dogs, canines and felines, and then with dogs we have shepherd dogs and we have police dogs, and then we even have our own dog, Fido or whatever it is. And taxonomies are ways in which we sort of construct a view of our experience, of our world. We also, however, put words into semantic domains. You've all heard about this type of thing. We, by the way, just published last year a domain dictionary of the Greek New Testament, about 20,000 different meanings, and we have 92 major domains and several hundred minor domains, so that all body parts are together, all the words for thinking are together, all the words for emotions are together. Why? Because the different meanings of the same word are not the problems for translators. They are the related meanings of different words, the so-called synonyms, which aren't really identical, but are very close. Those are the things that cause difficulty for translators, and that's why we've focused on those domains. Now, we find that these are not only functional domains in language, but they are also psychologically valid. They are part of the way in which our minds are wired, the way in which we remember. I don't know whether you have trouble with proper names, but I do have a lot of trouble remembering proper names, because they aren't structured into domains. Common words are. For example, we have clusters like run, walk, jump, crawl, dance. These are all movement by the limbs in various ways. Or we could sort of diagram that kind of a thing by speaking this way, that they are clusters. And then we have overlapping ones, love and like, for example. Or we have included ones. So we have walk and we have amble and saunter and various ones. And it's very interesting that when they try to probe the brains of people for word recognition, when they've had very bad accidents in certain parts of the brain, especially on the left-hand side for right-handed people, if they can reach one particular element within that domain, then the other words seem to come next. And there's a very close relationship in these things. Then, of course, we have the complementary groups that relate to one another. So you have buy and sell and tie and untie, and then we have series of words that relate to one another, so that you have infinite series like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, repeating groups. And then we have certain ranks, like all the way from the captain down to the private in the army. So these are various ways in which we, by words, in a sense, model our experience, and therefore seem to have a rational way of talking about our universe. Now, some people have said that there is simply no thought without words. I want to come back to this type of thing later in a different connection. But that just doesn't quite hold up. The best psycholinguistics at the present time posits two areas of the brain, one for language and another which is a conceptual area. But you and I know very well that we've often had a very clear concept of something and we couldn't find the right word to use for it, couldn't we? Or haven't you had the experience of latching on to an idea and you say, oh, yes, I read that. Where was that? And you can't remember the language you read it in. We all have that experience, don't we? The concept is not tied to specific words. And of course, people often think graphically. They often think in terms of series of events. The mind is much more complex than earlier psychologists seem to have thought. The problem was that the only way they could get in the brain was by means of words. And now, of course, we have this whole exploding area of neurophysiology, which is giving us a tremendous amount of insight as to what takes place inside our skulls. So, we have naming, making declarations or asking questions, topic comment. We model. We actually use another aspect, psychological, is simply to think. Probably people spend more time using language to think than anything else. Students ought to anyway, but maybe they don't. Maybe they only memorize and don't think. But nevertheless, people probably engage in this use of language more than any other. Although I must say, there are some people I know who never talk so much as my grandmother used to say. They don't even stop for station identification. They just keep on going. But there is another way we use language, and that's for expression. This is not for communicating anything to anybody. If I hit my finger, I will say, ouch, and I don't care whether there's anybody around or not. This kind of, wow, hooray, ouch, damn it, my God. This isn't communicating anything except our feelings. We're expressing something. Children love to babble, don't they? They even like to talk when nobody's around. They talk when they're playing, even by themselves. And of course, so much depends on the emotive values in these. And it's so hard to always compare the motive values from one language to another. Now, you may translate literally and say, well, of course, that's right. But it all depends not only the language, but who's talking. For example, there was an American engineer down in Mexico. I heard about when I was down there years ago. He was he was a very proficient fellow and very much in demand in the mines there. And he knew Spanish perfectly. And there was a young Mexican fellow who really was not working, and he had to discipline him, and this particular Mexican fellow was so angry that he called this engineer everything he could think of. including, of course, hijo de puta. But this engineer paid no attention to it until at last this Mexican got together what English he knew, and he said, "You son of a bitch!" And the engineer hauled off and knocked him into the ground. Now, it is not the designative meaning of those words that was involved. It was the use of a particular language by a particular person under those circumstances. That is sociolinguistics. Now, how do you translate caramba into English? Well, it all depends on the circumstances. Quite frankly, sometimes it means damn it. But even damn it has quite a range of emotive meanings in English. Or it might mean hell. Or, my God. It depends on the context again. This is the use of language. Its function. Well, there are, of course, obviously the functions of language that you normally talk about. The first of these, of course, and perhaps the most important, the interpersonal. Now, these are the social ones. The interpersonal use of language. Basically, it is to establish and to maintain status and relations. One person with another. Now, I've given to you some handouts. I listed there, by the way, in that first set, which I didn't feel it necessary to take time to call your attention to, this business of the various domains and their relationships. But what about these address forms? Well, here is Professor Richard Allen Montague. Now, this is not a particular person. Don't get worried. This is not related to Montague's grammar. But Professor Richard Allen Montague would be a perfectly normal way in which this person would be introduced for a formal lecture. Now, if he were going to go to a service club to speak, he would probably not be introduced as professor, because that would immediately scare the audience. So if he has a good friend, the friend would say, "I want you to listen to Mr. Richard Montague." He might add from the university, but that professor business would just wreck the first 15 minutes of the speech. Now, students will speak of him, if they don't know him too well, Professor Montague. But if they have to take a course from him, and the other person also is taking that course, he's, of course, Prof. Montague. But if they both know who they're talking about, then it's simply Prof, isn't it? Now, if this man has a good friend, and they went to school together, they may not have seen each other too frequently. He might just speak of him as Richard. If he knows him well, it's Dick. And his wife probably ends up calling him Monty. So, the same person comes out with all kinds of different forms of names. I was in one class not long ago, and the same problem came up. Of course. And this becomes especially a problem in languages that almost systematically make differences of the way in which you speak to and about people. I made some bad mistakes in German because I figured Fräulein you know, unmarried woman, Frau, married woman. I had a very good friend. I've known this woman for a number of years, and I always spoke her about her as Fräulein so-and-so. And I was told, no, you must say Frau. Oh, I said, when did she get married? No, she became 40 years of age. So at a certain period of life in Germany, Fräuleins become Fraus, even though they're not married. And this is something I had to learn. But it's part of language. It's not just whether you're married or not married. Ms. in English. I wish I knew when to use this thing. When I don't know whether they're married or not, I just use Ms. to avoid problems. But it doesn't get me off the hook. Because some women don't like to be called, young women don't like to be called Ms. because that means that they are a part of women's lib. And as one person said, I'm all for women's lib, but I want to go through the door first. And so some of these women don't want to be marked with this because it may mean that they're sort of fanatics. And they much prefer to be called Ms. How do you solve the problem? I don't know. You simply have to be there and be using the language and hearing the language. But that's a part of sociolinguistics. The worst thing that I have come across is du and usted. When do you start using vous? Or tu and vous in French? Or du and sie in German. They're not all the same. And I had a terrible experience with du and usted in Spanish. Probably 60 years ago, I met a very distinguished scholar in Latin America, Mexico. He was about 10 years older than I was. And I was so impressed with the books he had written, of course I used usted. And did it for several years. We met from time to time. Then he came to work for me. Now, it seemed perfectly natural. He would use usted to me because I was his boss. I would use usted to him because he was a distinguished writer and scholar. But this went on year after year. And we worked more and more together. And I felt terrible saying usted, you know, all this type of thing. Sometimes you can't drop the thing completely. The reference isn't clear. And I kept using it until I just got to the point I couldn't stand it. Because we were such good friends. We did so many things together. So I said to him, oh, Professor Weissman, please, do you mind if I do the arte? Oh, he said, I've been wanting to do that for the last 10 years. But when do you start with Latins? Now, Americans can start calling each other by the first name after 10 minutes. But you don't do that in Latin America. How long do you have to wait? Where do you get the clue? I don't know. But it's part of language. It's a part of knowing and using language. It's part of the meaning of those words. Because the meaning is essentially simply a distillation of its functional potential. That's all. Well, emphatic speech. This is speech that's not supposed to make any sense much. You go to a cocktail party, you don't really expect to have important conversations. People don't want you to have important conversations. They want you to be pleasant and trivial and really say not much of anything, but to enjoy it and make them think you're enjoying it. Frankly, I find those things terribly boring. Emphatic speech to me is just a terrible nuisance. But you have to engage in it at times. What do you do in an office? This is not an easy problem. In an American office, for example, how do you speak to people? For example, in most American offices, a boss will speak to a person below, if it's on a secretarial, clerical level, and simply use a first name. That person will always speak to the boss by saying Mr. or Doctor or Professor or whatever title is given to that particular person. Now what happens when a woman moves up into managerial class? How do the other women talk to her? That's hard for people. Do you want to say, now that you've moved up and you've become an official, that we now can no longer be friendly like we were before? And most women don't want people to change. And yet these people are expected to change in order to recognize linguistically the hierarchical structure. It's a very difficult decision that people have to make. And different women make this type of distinction in different ways, and different men do too. If you are on the same level, you normally use first name. If you're 2 or 3 levels between you, you always use a last name. But if there's only 1 level between you, you probably, if you've known them for a long time, you could use a first name. Now, you usually get the signal from that, from the upper person to the lower person. But that's not an easy thing. And it's fascinating to draw 2 diagrams of the communication pattern and the authority pattern. And you can pretty well determine what the weak communication pattern is by the ways in which they address or speak about one another. It shows a great deal about who's talking to whom about what. And by the way, the communication structure is far more relevant in terms of who makes the decisions about what than the scheme that is normally presented to the board of directors. I knew an organization in which there were 3 women secretaries who met every day to open the mail. And they decided to what officer the mail should go to, unless it was specifically addressed to a particular person. And they knew ahead of time what kind of an answer would be given to that particular question. And the truth of the matter is, those 3 secretaries had more influence in decision-making than the men who thought they were running. Because the men had a policy of never sending colleagues a copy of their correspondence. Fascinating. Life is much more interesting than some people think. Secondly, there is an informative aspect. This is the way in which you establish and maintain interpersonal relations. Information, this particular function, is to influence the cognitive content of other people's brains, as it were. To influence their thinking. But frankly, probably not more than 20% of what is communicated is informative. Really. This is the estimate that Joe made of a very extensive database. Now, of course, there are these so-called maxims of communication. And they're all very nice, but there are only 2 that really count. One is it relevant? And secondly, is it true? And the relevance has to deal with both the subject matter and the person. I have a friend, he's a great professor, fascinating guy. But you cannot ask him a question without getting the entire answer. His daughter went to her mother one time and said to her mother, "Mommy, tell me, what is this anyway? What's that all about?" "Oh," she said, "go to your father." And the girl said to her mother, "Mommy, I don't want to know that much about it." And this is the way a lot of us react in times, don't we? Because this whole business of communication is it relevant? Is it true? Now, wouldn't it change political campaigns tremendously if there was some kind of law of maxims in communication? We would have much shorter campaigns, and they certainly would have different content, at least in the United States. But several of the Indian languages in South America have a marvelous system. At the end of every short paragraph, they have an enclitic. And one means, "I saw this myself." The second means, "I've heard it on good authority." The third is, "This is purely doubtful, mythological. I don't take any responsibility for it." You know, they're ahead of us in many regards. There's a third type of thing. You're familiar with it, imperative. Imperative communication is to try to change people's behavior. When you yell fire, you're trying to change people's behavior. But you don't do it just with imperatives. People misunderstand. They think they can analyze imperative structures by counting the imperatives in a discourse. That isn't true. When you tell a very pointed joke, that may influence behavior much more. Or talk about the parables of Jesus. Those have influenced more people's behavior than any commands he made. Of course. So, language which is designed to change behavior is imperative language, in a sense. And then performative part. Formative is designed to change the status or state of a person. To bless, to curse, to damn. And of course, in some societies, when a curse not only has power but can never even be taken back, this becomes a real problem. But we have performative language, of course. We have, for instance, marriage. I now pronounce you man and wife. Now they're changing to husband and wife. Now, normally in the United States, it doesn't cost more than about $25 to $50 to have that done. But to have it undone is going to cost you about half of all you have. But it's those words spoken and then, of course, placed in the legal deposit, which makes the difference. I remember one time I was talking with an Arab in the Sudan, and he said to me, "How do you get married?" Well, I explained the type of thing that goes on and how expensive it was and all the rest. And he said, "Well, how do you get a divorce?" So I tried to explain that to him. He said, "You mean to tell me that you can't just say, 'I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you'?" I said, no, that won't work. He said, "I'll never be a Christian." Because in the Sudan at that time, there were two sets of laws, one for Arabs and the other for Christians. Well, words make a difference, are performative. Emotive. Of course, we use words to cry, make people laugh. The fascinating thing is the people that can do this make more money than anybody else. And lastly, there's the aesthetic. Aesthetic use of language. Language is a medium for aesthetic expression. Shelley for poetry, Poe for prose, or whoever you want to use. Now, the important thing about this, though, is not these various ones, but the fact that practically no discourse is always one function. Almost always there is a combination of functions. A political speech is almost always at least somewhat interpersonal. The speaker wants to relate himself to people. Did you see the debate, the second debate in the United States? I've seen this on television here a tremendous amount. It was very interesting that Bush stood behind his little, what do you call it, pulpit as it were, and spoke. But Clinton walked right up to the person who had asked the question. Now, space makes a difference in that type of communication. That's one of these extra linguistic features that we'll mention. But it's interpersonal. It is emotive because he wants to make certainly an emotional impression on people. And only lastly, frankly, is it informative. Frost's poems, for example, are basically emotive because he feels them, you feel that he feels them. Secondly, they're aesthetic, but they're not so aesthetic as to have lost their emotive quality. You feel there's so much genuineness about them. And lastly, they're very interpersonal. And various types of discourse, of course, range on this particular area. Then, of course, you have the contradictory and indirect and ironic and imitative forms of communication. Irony. And it's terribly hard to spot irony in a printed text because most irony comes out with intonation and voice, quality of voice, and also facial gestures. But obviously, if you said something like Saddam's love for the Shiites knows no limits, you immediately say to yourself, oh, what under the sun is he talking about then? And then you know it's pure irony. But indirection is a fascinating form of communication. I once had to meet with an Iraqi who was mentioned to me as a possible translator of the scriptures into a form of speech in the northern part of Iraq. I was told he was a poor professor in Paris and desperately needed a job, and I should find him, and he probably was at the Sorbonne. Well, I went to the Sorbonne and I talked to the secretary, and she really didn't know anything about this guy. But she looked it up, and she found that he was going to come and going to give a course in Arabic literature sometime in the fall. And I said, well, where is he living? Oh, she said, I think you'll find him at the Hotel Continental. Uh-oh, I said to myself. A man who is that poor doesn't live at the Hotel Continental in Paris. But I went to the Hotel Continental. And I went day after day. I was supposed to be sure to find this man. Frankly, I didn't want to stay in Paris that long, but I could only spend a few minutes a day trying to find out about this guy, and the rest of the time I went to the Louvre and other places. I enjoyed myself. My wife and I had a great time of it. But anyway, finally I got acquainted with the red cap at the hotel, sort of there at the entrance. And because I'd asked him so many times about this particular professor, supposed professor, and he said, let me tell you, he's very seldom here. Don't bother coming back. He usually spends his weeks with his girlfriend in her chateau. Now, that wasn't telling me he isn't poor and all the rest. It was telling me what he did, and by the way, he actually rented an apartment in the hotel. So, when the secretary at the Sorbonne was telling me, you'll probably find him at the Hotel Continental, she wasn't telling me he's a page, and he isn't poor and all the rest. She was trying to tell me indirectly something that I ought to figure out without sort of spilling the beans, as it were. Okay. Now let's look a little more closely at the nature of language, focusing on this sociolinguistic perspective. And here I want to get down to some sort of technical matter. Forgive me. First of all, we linguists, and I'm a linguist, and I'm guilty of this too, have had some false assumptions about language. We have been so impressed with the fascinating structures in language that we've gotten the idea that language is rule-governed. And we love to develop generic rules that cover a tremendous area of language operation. Out of this has grown computational linguistics. And some of the rules and the hieroglyphics which they use in explaining the rules and their formulas are really fantastic. I admire what they've done, because they assume that language is essentially a logical system. Now, language is rational, but it is not rule-governed and totally logical. Sapir was right when he said, all grammars leak. There are some things about a language that just do not fit. We would love to be able to explain a language all with fixed forms, just plus and minus features. It would be grand, wouldn't it, if all we needed was a grammar and a dictionary and we'd have the language. One woman, you won't believe this, but she was a school teacher who wrote to the Bible Society and said that she had now retired, and if we would just send her a dictionary and a grammar of one of those languages that didn't have the Bible, she would bone up on it and translate. Poor soul. We don't even have dictionaries and grammars of those languages in the first place. And you cannot become a translator by just knowing a grammar and a dictionary. You know that, of course. You see, too often we've focused on words and just combinations of words. And we have not talked enough about performance as well as competence. And all we know about competence comes from performance, at least intonation. Now, what we need now, and what is developing very rapidly with Hines and Leboff and a number of others, is a theory of performance. That is sociolinguistics. Hines' work on the ethnography of communication is a marvelous beginning of that type of thing. Mind you, a code, language as a code, is only a set of potentialities of a language. It is that use of language which tells us how those potentialities can be actualized. And no part, as I mentioned before, is autonomous. Communication is far more complex than language, because communication of language touches reality in so many different places. That seems to me the tremendous insight which we gain from this type of thing. This was hard for me to take, frankly, when I started. I wrote a book on morphology years ago, trying to analyze all the ways that any language in the world could put words together and the rest, and it looks very neat, and I liked it. But my job was to go all around the world. My wife and I traveled between 7 and 8 months a year for about 40 years, working in different areas of the world to try to help people translate. And it was largely to help them become aware of the problems they hadn't recognized before. But the use of language is so much more complex than the kind of rules that we get for how to put words together. Of course. Now, let me just mention one thing that is on your sheet. Look at the word double. You say double. Oh, well, that's perfectly obvious. Double the money. Twice as much money. Okay? He doubled the blanket. Now, this is not twice as much blanket. This is just twice as thick. But it's the same blanket. He has a double. This means there is somebody who looks sufficiently like him that under certain circumstances, that person can pose as the first person. Especially this is true in dramas. Almost every main actor has a double. All right? The families doubled up. Now, they were not bent over like this. They doubled up two or more families in the same house. Or he was doubled up in pain. Yes, he was bent over. But the daily double. This means that when you went to the horse race, you bet on two particular races and you won both. You don't just make it double what you would have otherwise win. You probably make it 20 times what you would otherwise win. Or he hit the double. This means that in baseball, he hit the ball far enough that he could run to second base. And he rented a double room. The room is not twice as big. It just has 2 beds in it, that's all. Now, it doesn't have even a double bed. It has 2 beds. So you say to yourself, now how do you deal with all of those meanings? Well, you just describe them. And you say, this particular meaning has the potentiality of being used in a certain general area. But how are you going to state clearly what the limits of those areas are? It's almost impossible. For example, my wife and I always have an issue. Is it a cup or is it a demi-tasse? Or is it a cup or a mug? Leboeuf used this particular illustration. But you can use it in all kinds of things. What's the difference between a slipper and a sandal and a shoe and pumps? Well, there's weight, there's various forms to it. But women have a wonderful time arguing about this thing. In English, we never seem to be able to decide exactly what it is, because you can keep on arguing. How big does a thread have to be before it's a string? Or a string have to be thick in order to be a cord? Or how big does a cord have to be before it becomes a small rope? And how big does a rope have to be before it becomes a hawser? Nobody knows. Oh, the government sends out lists of figures and dimensions, because that's why we have a department for this type of thing. But they admit that they're purely arbitrary. And that's the marvelous thing about language, because, you see, it has all loose ends. And this means that you can push these words out into various directions. Language isn't fixed. We can understand things we never heard before. We can say things we've never heard before. We can write poetry. We'd have no poetry if language was all fixed in form. Nothing creative. Language would be one terrible bore. Now, language has to be at, shall we say, squashy limits to it. It has to have undefined borders. It has to have this kind of belong to a bunch of fuzzy sets, as mathematicians talk about. Because, you see, there are simply billions of objects in this world. And how are you going to have a separate word for every chair, or for every bench or desk? Every one of these bottles. We couldn't manage with billions of words in our heads. We have to have words to talk about classes of things, don't we? Therefore, we're going to often be ambiguous because those classes overlap or they're included one within another, as I pointed out on the board. So, we're dealing with fuzzy sets. But people say, oh, that's all right for words. We admit they're impossible. And that's what Chomsky likes to do, is to put all of those nasty little problems over into subcategorization under words. But what do you do with syntax? They would say, syntax, that's obvious. I would like to give you then a series of those. Look at this sheet. His car. Now, this particular construction in English is regarded as a possessive construction. And most people regard it as the same construction. Now, of course, transformationists are much more sophisticated than that. But let's look at the fact that even here are relationships which they do not speak about. His car, of course, theoretically owns it, but probably the mortgage company really possesses it. His house, he may own it or he may not own it. It's the place where he normally stays. His arm. In many languages, you cannot say his house and his art, because his arm, the house can be sold. His house, you can sell the house. His arm, you don't normally sell your arm. It's called intimate possession. His father, you don't own your father. You happen to be biologically related. His partner. Now this means this is a person with whom this individual in the his participates with in some kind of activity. His country. He doesn't own the thing, although I think that Mobutu could probably say he owns Zaire. He has enough money, robbed enough money out that he could have paid the entire debt for it. But nevertheless, you don't own the country, you're a part of it. His work. He does it, or it may be the object which he, for example, painted or wrote. His boss. He certainly doesn't own his boss. The boss, as it were, owns him, at least his time. His punishment, he gets punished. He is the object of the event of punishing. His God. I tried to ask an Indian up in the northern part of Canada one time, how do I say my God? He said, we don't say that. Who owns God? And so I said, how do you say it? Oh, he said, it's the God I worship. I said, by the way, it's a little bit better than just saying my God. Or his heir. Now this is a complex relationship because it means, number one, is a person who it has or will receive something from number two, presumably when number two dies. Now that's quite a mouthful of componential features to put into one word and then to relate the his to the heir. His attacker, that's someone who attacks him. His folly, he does something which is foolish. His party, he is a member of a particular group of people, and his hearing. Either he's doing the hearing, or the judge is going to hear him, hear his case. Now, of course syntax is ambiguous. It has to be ambiguous. We couldn't possibly have enough different syntactic constructions to match all the relationships that can exist between people who need to communicate. Of course. So, fuzzy sets, ambiguous expressions, undetermined limits, squashy potentialities, all of these are an essence of language. theoretically go till 7 o'clock. Is that right? Okay. I want to just, well,